2, 1. All right, my name is Bret Schweinfurth. I'm going to be addressing the Invalid Corps today, a unit that I've been researching for the last 22 years. I will be working off of items out of my collection. And so items that I have that I'll be referencing, that I'll be showing, there'll be a lot of pictures during this, are all based off of what I own. If I don't own them, they will be referenced. And so starting off, the Invalid Corps was an idea that started in April of 1863, but prior to that, in General Order 69, done in 63, was a way of taking soldiers that were in convalescent camps or hospitals and a way of using them as detachments, invalid detachments. And so men would be put out on light duty, although still born on their original company rosters, and they would be used in hospitals as guard duty, moving troops, moving supplies, guarding supplies, hospital assistance, and etc. And here's General Order 69 showing, as well as 2 papers showing how the men were on invalid detachment. Moving on, here in May of 63 was Michael Kearns, who was being used. He's written as being mustered on invalid detachment. But if you look at the back side of the paper, it says that he was in the Invalid Corps as of May of 63. Michael Kearns was never in the Invalid Corps. He was strictly on invalid detachment. So right away, soldiers were getting lost and misplaced. But come April of 1863, under General Order 105, it states the organization of an Invalid Corps is hereby authorized. And it pretty much goes into detail over what the expectations are of what they knew at that time the expectations would be. Listed below is the original name that they had that was written by a civilian out of New York State, calling it the Invalid Corps of Honor, stating how this is probably the most useful organization which could have been instituted for the benefit of disabled and wounded soldiers. It affords the honors of the battlefield with the opportunity of being fed, clothed, and paid. Moving on, the invalids were given distinct uniforms. Under General Order 124 of 1863 in May, the following uniform has been adapted for the Invalid Corps. A jacket of sky blue kersey with dark blue trimmings, cut like that jacket of the United States Cavalry, which really wasn't true. It was cut like a Chaucer jacket. As you'll see behind me here, it is an original invalid jacket. Trousers were regulation and cap was regulation. And the one thing that separated the invalids as well is they were not allowed to wear private purchase hats. They had to go with the military issue, the kepi or the bummer. They weren't allowed to have the slouch hat. Moving up to officers, under General Order 158, May 29, 1863, the following uniform adopted for the officers of the Invalid Corps: frock coat of sky blue cloth with dark blue velvet collar and cuffs, in all other respects according to the present pattern for officers of infantry. Shoulder straps according to present regulation, but worked on dark blue velvet. Pantaloons, pants, being sky blue cloth with a double stripe of dark blue cloth down the outer seam, each stripe 1/2 inch wide with the space in between of 3/8 inch. And you see the officer there wearing that uniform. And then again, behind me is the officer's uniform from the Invalid Corps. There was much confusion as to what exactly regulated an invalid into the Corps, and there was a lot of questions as to what was happening. Did General Order 69 still exist where men would be on invalid detachment, or were they Invalid Corps? So the military released General Order 173, revising General Order 105, and there was also General Order 130, and they brought it up, starting General Order 173 by saying, General Order 69 from the War Department is hereby revoked. So therefore, there was no longer an invalid detachment where you were still on your company's roster as well as an invalid roster. You were solely the property of the Invalid Corps. Moving forward, people started to understand what the Invalid Corps was and how it existed, but they didn't understand the conditions behind the ailments. And so if my man stubs his toe, am I going to send him to the Invalid Corps, or do I just let him heal? If my man is severe, what is the severity regulations of sending that man to the Invalid Corps? And so one letter came in here to the adjutant asking, please define this. Please let us know the conditions and what it means to be in the Invalid Corps. And so being responded via Richard Rush from Rush's Lancers, who was being colonel to the Provost Marshal General, saying, we're going to release a circular to better address the conditions of what makes a man an invalid or what sends him home. So General Order 212, July of 63, gave all the ailments, all the conditions, down to this makes you an invalid soldier or this makes you going home. With that, officers were finding that as they were being placed in certain outposts, they were not getting the respect required upon them. And so here's a letter from an officer, Hannibal Norton, referencing General Order 212, saying, my post is to be here. I am responsible. I am in control, but I am not being allowed that control. I am not being allowed the magnitude of my duties. And on the backside, as a response, was saying, being that we don't know the conditions of the Invalid Corps as it has not been fully tested, we're not exactly sure what you are in charge of or what you aren't in charge of. All we know is that you need to be where you're stationed. Moving forward, as the men were growing in numbers, they were broken up into battalions based on the ailments of each soldier. And so here, companies of the 1st Battalion will be employed mainly as provost guards, guards in the cities. They will be armed with muskets, and note that is a musket, and not liable for active campaigns. Although on the side here is one of the reports from Camp Douglas in Chicago, Illinois, saying that the men were issued infield rifles. Men of the 2nd Battalion would have a stronger ailment up to amputations, and they would be armed with sidearms only. Sidearms being an NCO sword or a revolver. As you'll see in the reports here, there's 54 swords being ordered as well as 54 revolvers. And certain men here were issued the Savage revolvers. And the picture you'll see there, the man has both the NCO sword and a revolver. The Invalid Corps, as it was being structured, had in place a structure for a 3rd Battalion. And so ideally it was set up that men of the 2nd Battalion would be missing a hand or an arm, and men of the 3rd Battalion would be missing a foot or a leg. But there wasn't enough men in strength to field a 3rd Battalion, so they all went into the 2nd Battalion. But right here in a newspaper from August of 63, it talks about a 3rd Battalion. And in the letter written by a civilian out of New York, again, it talks about a 3rd Battalion. As the men were coming in and they had to decide which battalion they would go into, they took their, obviously the soldier's name, they'd have to write down their ailment or their disability, and then what duty they would be fit for, whether they were fit for guard, nurse, police, etc. And so at the bottom, you'll see wound of both legs. He is a guard. So it's a non-mobile position. He would not be marching or moving. He would be standing, versus men who had wound of the right leg, one leg could still be a police or guard. He could move. And then chronic rheumatism was a nurse. You're going to be moving around quite a bit. So as the numbers formed, the companies, the battalions, and regiments started forming. And here we'll see men of the Invalid Corps lined up in Washington, D.C. And you'll see the officer that I've highlighted is missing his right hand. As they got the men together, they started finding which posts they were going to go to, which jobs they were going to take on, and how they were going to handle these jobs. And so here you'll see Invalid Corps in Washington, D.C. guarding medical supplies. They also guarded rations, food supplies, clothing, and major outposts where officers would be. As the men were being moved out and put in specific locations, they would be under the care of that location. But this led to a lot of confusion, so men ended up missing. So you'll see the documents here. The first one saying, "Sir, I have the honor to inform you that the charge of desertion against the following named men, they're actually in the Invalid Corps." And there's numerous ones here of men not being paid because they were away when the paymaster showed up, or they were put in certain hospital posts and the hospitals weren't accounting for them. And so a lot of men were marked deserted, AWOL, missing, absent, or otherwise away and unknown because they were guarding a certain post or attached to a certain hospital. As it moved on, they started moving men outside of Washington, D.C., and here was where the Invalid Corps of the 1st Regiment responded to the New York draft riots. And so men were sent up to work as military police to control the streets of New York and help get some control over the riots that were happening there. And as it says here in the newspaper, at the word of command, the men halted and fired a volley over the heads of the crowd. The latter then rushed, but were met by a second volley, which is said to have killed 6 of the rioters. The crowd, however, were not deterred, but rushed on the soldiers, disarmed a number of them, and so pressed on that they were compelled to retreat, which they did slowly. And so although they were there for the riots, I don't know if they supplied a great force to help the cause. Men were then being moved out to other states, other locations. And as you'll see here on the map, anywhere that there's a red dot is where a company or regiment was formed, most of them being around the Washington, D.C. area, but they went all the way down to the end of Louisiana. So on the papers that I've supplied here, you'll see Rock Island Barracks of Illinois, Washington, D.C., New Haven, Connecticut, Louisiana, Ohio, and so on. Men that were being moved and being transported around usually did so without supplies. So as this document says here, it's talking about moving a company of men, and it's right on the bottom fold there, so it's a little hard to read, but camp garrison equipment will not be carried by the troops. So the men would not carry haversacks, they would not carry knapsacks, they did not carry the supplies, they just marched. Moving forward, as the 1st Battalion was growing much stronger than the 2nd Battalion, there was concern that the 2nd Battalion was going to be disbanded. And so the letters here is how there was talk of the 2nd Battalion being mustered out, disbanded, or just outright done away with. And so a response from Colonel Wisewell of the Provost Marshal said, "Respectfully returned, although we have no reason to suppose that the 2nd Battalion of the Invalid Corps will be dispensed with, yet should that cause be deemed advisable, such the officers will be transferred into the 1st Battalion." So they weren't looking to get rid of men, and they weren't looking to get rid of battalions, they were just trying to make it work. As they moved forward, growing stronger in numbers, they opened it up that men who had been discharged pre-Invalid Corps, so 1861, 1862, under a surgeon's medical discharge, they were allowed back. And so if you were out for reasons of surgeon certificate of disability and you wanted back in the service, the door was open. You had to prove that you were meritorious and deserving. You had to prove that you had a proper discharge, and you had to prove that you were willing, and you would show up to your local enrollment board and show up with all your paperwork saying, "I am ready, I am willing, and I want a part of it." Such as the case here with Charles Cummings, who was originally discharged in January of '63 by reason of surgeon certificate of disability. So January of '63, and the Invalid Corps started April of '63. So when the Invalid Corps started, he came back and said, "I want it," and got a second discharge when he was done under General Order 155. So he ended up with 2 discharges, one from his original unit and one from the Veteran Reserve. So it'd be a state discharge and a government discharge. As men were coming back, they opened it up saying, "We're not solely a corps of invalids, but we are veterans." And so they said, "We are not an Invalid Corps, we need to be a Veteran Reserve Corps." And this was a way, as I believe, to attract men to come back and stay in the military, because their 3-year enlistment would be expiring at this time. And so if they change the name to the Veteran Reserve, they run a chance of getting men to re-enlist and enlisting in the Veteran Reserve and staying on in the government service. And so General Order number 111, March of 64, changed the name of the Invalid Corps to the Veteran Reserve Corps. And on the top was a letter saying that it is accepted that the Invalid Corps will be changed to the Veteran Reserve. And one civilian wrote to their brother who was in the Corps saying, you know, be excited because you're being moved into the Veteran Reserve. And he said, no, you made a mistake. The Veteran Reserve is simply the Invalid Corps. And as it went forward, although you came back, although you were in, you already passed the surgeon's report, men still died under numerous conditions. The top one was died of wounds received from the hands of a copperhead. And so they were close enough to the bad men, the bad people. The bottom left one is William Drake, who had died of heart disease. Now, the invalid pictured John Tyler. There was a John Tyler of the Invalid Corps who was working in the kitchen of Washington, D.C., and was taken suddenly with convulsions and died the next day. Upon autopsy, his lungs were engorged with blood, heart contained a large white clot, pus found in the peritoneal cavity, and spleen was macerated. And that's all from the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. And so it wasn't always you were in the best health when you were there, because men still had ailments that they still suffered from. Moving forward, the Army-Navy Journal, April 2nd of 64, was talking how 1 year ago, the progress of the war up to the time found a large number of men absent from their regiments in hospitals and convalescent camps on account of wounds or other disabilities, but whose names were still borne on the company rolls, a mere weight to the Army. So talking about that separation of having men on two rosters, one their company roll and two the hospital roll. But the Invalid Corps changed that. And so the other side of the paper says, for efficiency, completeness, and instruction of discipline, especially where an organization into regiments has been effectually carried out, it may be admitted that this Corps has already unsurpassed by any body of troops in the Army, and the amount of duty it now performs is heavy, even for the ablest men. A higher organization than that of regiments, considering the nature of the duties of the Corps performed, is hardly required. So moving forward, we go to the Shenandoah Valley campaign, where Jubal Early and Breckinridge were moving up, heading north, and people were questioning what he was going to do, what the moves were going to do, and why they were doing it. So they headed up north and then headed east, heading towards Frederick, Maryland, where they had a battle of Monocacy, July 9th, 1864. And people were questioning, would they go to Baltimore to take the ports and have the ships, or would they go to Washington, D.C.? And they thought it would be foolish to go to Washington, D.C. because that was the capital. But they wanted to be prepared. So the document there is July 9th, 1864, the day of Monocacy. There was invalids being put on detachments to the provost in D.C. to be extra hands in case something happened. These men could scatter around Washington, D.C. and get the word out. Well, Jubal Early headed straight for Washington, D.C. And as the newspaper here talks about the late invasion, full details in the attack upon the fortifications north of Washington, the forts manned by veterans, invalids, and citizens. Now, when they were looking for men to guard Washington, D.C., ideally most men were gone. The soldiers were out in the field. And of course, the Invalid Corps, Veteran Reserve Corps said, well, we are ready. Well, under General Order 130, and it was again confirmed under General Order 212, the invalids were no longer to be involved in field campaign, meaning they would no longer be in battle. So when the men were coming and heading right for Washington, D.C., the Veteran Reserve were overlooked. And they turned to the statesmen inside the Capitol and said, although you're a scriber, you're a writer, you're a secretary, you're going to defend the Capitol first. And only when it came down the last line, when they said, we need more men, were the men of the Invalid Corps, the Veteran Reserve Corps, put into duty at Fort Stevens and DeRussy, and they did fight. Just after that, President Lincoln was a big fan of the Veteran Reserve Corps, and the day before he went for his Gettysburg Address was watching men of the 1st Regiment out on parade in Washington, D.C. And when he went to do his Gettysburg Address, he said, "I will take these men with me." And so as the newspaper here says, the tour of the president, on the bottom there, it says officers of the Invalid Corps were in his train car. So the Invalid Corps escorted Abraham Lincoln to do his Gettysburg Address all the way up to the rail line, and I believe to the Wills House. And then from there, it was turned over to the regular military. But the Invalids were the one that escorted him to Gettysburg. The annual Encyclopedia of 1864 had a paragraph talking about how the Provost Marshal reported that the Veteran Reserve Corps, as of October 1st, 1864, officers of 28,738, of officers and 28,738 men, its discipline instruction good, and that the entire Corps is doing the duty of which otherwise would be performed by an equal number of able-bodied troops detached from the armies, and filling that it is yet inadequate in numbers to fill the demands made on it. It has rendered valuable service in guarding the depots, and volunteers, substitutes, and drafted men, and escorting detachments to the regiments. And during the summer campaign of the Army of the Potomac, its operations were extended almost to the front. And that's talking directly about Washington, D.C., where they went into battle. As we come to the end of the war, and there was the assassination of Abraham Lincoln done at Ford's Theater, the Invalid Corps showed up and helped in the pursuit of John Wilkes Booth, and they returned to Ford's Theater feeling that John Wilkes Booth would return to the theater because he knew it so well and considered it a second home. And so the picture here from the Library of Congress has 2 soldiers out in front, which are the Invalid Corps, Veteran Reserve, and they were the ones who shut down and locked up Ford's Theater and stood guard over it, waiting to see if John Wilkes Booth would return. When the president's remains were to be deemed moved to Illinois, it was 29 invalids that were deemed the ones that would be responsible for the late president's remains. And so they always escorted the coffin, they always escorted the body anywhere it was to go. If it was on display, the invalids would leave and leave it up to the standard army in the area to stand guard over it, but they were not allowed to handle the coffin, they were not allowed to move it. And as it shows here during the parade where it says pallbearers, you could see that there was always the Invalid Corps surrounding that coffin. They were also responsible for the president's train. 3 men would stand on guard at all times from the point that it left Washington, D.C. all the way up to when it arrived in Illinois. 3 men always stood guard, whether the other men were inside guarding the coffins. 3 men were always on duty. Even if the president's remains were removed from the train, President's son, Willie, who was deceased, his coffin was in the front of the train, and so these men were then responsible for that. In Grand Review in Washington, D.C., as the soldiers were being sent home, it was the Invalid Corps that stood guard over the stage box where the officers and now the new president stood. And so it was the invalids who were put in control of the situation, and now the guards of Washington, D.C. And they did a lot of work signing out regiments and companies that were going home. In fact, one man signed out his original unit, and he deemed it unfair because he thought if he wasn't in the Invalid Corps Veteran Reserve, he would be going home. But instead, he signed out his brothers and his neighbors. As the conspirators were being held in D.C., the Invalid Corps were put in control of guarding them. And so here is a handwritten letter talking about the Booth capture, and the conspirators saying, "My regiment as guarding 8 or 10 prisoners, Booth's accomplices. The fellow that stabbed Secretary Seward is among them, and the one that was with Booth when he was killed. I understand that they are to have their trial this week, and there's no doubt but they will all be hung. They are all heavily ironed and blindfolded by drawing sort of a bag over their face and mouth and then locked in a dungeon in the strongest kind of guard over them. And then for the 4 men that were, or 3 men and a lady, who were tried and convicted for the conspiracy, as they were to be hung, the 4 men that are underneath the gallows that sprung it, bringing the 4 to their death, those were all members of the Veteran Reserve Corps, so they were still in D.C. The military, trying to show honors to the Veteran Reserve Corps officers, released this book of the field record of the officers of the Veteran Reserve Corps. And so it would, in part, explain what rank they held, their name, their age, where they came from, original unit, ailments that got them into the Veteran Reserve. But this was mainly set up for Veteran Reserve that was in the service at the time this book was released. And so men who had come and gone before this book weren't mentioned. So over my shoulder here is Captain Andrew Winters, and he is not mentioned in this book, but I have the documentation that he was in fact in the Veteran Reserve. And so looking back at the service of what the Veteran Reserve did, now late June of 1865, so the war is well over and most of the men are gone, one of the invalids behind in Washington, D.C. was reflecting back saying, I'm still on court-martial duty up near the War Department and have to go down at 10 o'clock every day. I would be so obliged this morning to write this morning in order to have it go off in today's mail. My duties are not very hard at present. Still, the work goes on. We are putting up a splendid flagpole on our parade grounds. When up, it'll be 112 feet high. The old flag that we hoist on makes me think of my many dangers that I have passed through during the past 4 years. Anything that has been bought so dearly as that cannot be valued too highly. It is a fact that the old stars and stripes are thought of more today than ever before. Long may it wave over the home of the brave and land of the free. I am glad I have fought in its defense. Should another chance be offered, I would again go in its defense. I hope I will never have to. So coming towards the end of 1865, going into 1866, General Order 155 said, if we no longer have use for a single soldier in the Veteran Reserve Corps, they will be disbanded. They will be discharged and sent home. And so men were being sent home as they wanted, as their terms were being expired and they were moving on. But many men still wanted to stay behind and they still wanted to be a part of it. Showing here the ailments of the Invalid Corps, Veteran Reserve Corps, from the Daily National Intelligencer in November of 65 said admitted into the Corps from gunshot wounds was 85%, from injuries received 5%, and from disease 10%. And then they go on to say there is force in the statement that the Veteran Reserve Corps is the sole representative military establishment of that vast volunteer force that constituted the mass of troops that put down the rebellion. As they were sending men home and talking about discharging all the officers, many of the officers got together and said, no, we've earned our position, we're taking our position, and we want to keep our position. So here's the officer writing to his fellow officers in the Invalid Corps saying, we need to stay where we are. You need to write the officers above you, and if the statesmen saying, you want to hold your position, you're not ready to be discharged. So from that, they took the enlisted soldiers and broke them down into 4 companies or regiments. I'm sorry, I don't remember right off which, but they worked them into the 1st Infantry. So they now became standard infantry and standard march, doing standard procedures, no longer so much considered an invalid. And so the ribbon there shows the new name they encountered, which was the 1st Infantry Veteran Reserve. Next to it is the rosters and officers of civilians on duty in the Bureau of Refugees, Freemen, and Abandoned Lands in North Carolina. Many of the men, officers, who were still active service in the Invalid Corps, Veteran Reserve Corps, were the ones who helped establish and set up the Bureau of Refugees, Freemen, and Abandoned Lands, as shown here with many of the names that you'll see, still have the Veteran Reserve Corps name attached onto them. And this document was out in 1868. As it went on, it went into 1869. They then said, we really have no use for the Veteran Reserve Corps. We have no position ready for them. We have no purpose for them. They will be disbanded. And going forward, they said men who were discharged on account of wounds and amputees received in the war under General Order 73 of 1866 said the government will supply artificial limbs for them. And then showing here in 1867 going into 1868, they were discharging the men slowly and getting them out. One newspaper, hearing that they would be fully discharged, said, men who have attested their devotion to the country under leaden rain and iron hail and have been stricken grievously by wounds deserve special consideration in the line of duty for which they are fitted. So they were trying to find positions and reasons to keep these men. But in 1869, the Veteran Reserve Corps was disbanded and they no longer had a purpose. Men after the war moved on. Some carried the title of Veteran Reserve Corps and some went back to considering themselves a part of their state's units. And so there was a board here that was scrap wood left over from a cabinet that was made in New York celebrating the history of the city, and the man signed it saying, I was happy to work on this piece, part of the Company H, I believe that's 6th Veteran Reserve Corps. Going over to the document there, out of Bedford, Pennsylvania, the man had to testify in court that he was invalid, disabled, and the way that he proved that was showing that he was in Company B of the 14th U.S. Veteran Reserve Corps, and that they found him disabled then, so he was fighting, saying that he needed a disabled status so that he could go around town and peddle and be a panhandler. That's pretty much it for what I have in the research that I've done. A very, very broad shroud over what I have. But as I went along, a lot of questions come up as to what people feel the Invalid Corps is. And a lot of times it's not at all connected with the Invalid Corps, the Veteran Reserve Corps. So I put, from my research, this is what the Invalid Corps is not. People say that they have gray hat cords, which are original Civil War Invalid Corps, Veteran Reserve Corps. Again, they were not allowed to wear private purchase hats. As you'll see below it, numerous men, invalids, lined up on duty, every one of them wearing a kepi, a bummer, not a slouch hat, not a private purchase. The only time I've seen gray hat cords, as you see there on that top hat, from the Grand Army of the Republic. Next to that, the SVR is the Sons of the Veteran Reserve. People connect the term Veteran Reserve to the Veteran Reserve Corps, but the Sons of the Veteran Reserve were children of soldiers, and those soldiers that were in the Grand Army of the Republic. Below it, they talk about the IC stamping, talking about how items that were marked with IC were inspected, condemned, which the order was released July of '63 through the War Department, but was quickly vetoed because men were reporting, as Eli Whitney said, if you mark something with an IC, it makes it hard for me to reverse it, because he would buy items, say weapons, and he would make them fully functional and sell them. But if people saw that stamp, they were drawn away from it. So the IC stamp didn't really hold up. The two that you'll see there with the musket, a rifle, and bayonet with the IC stamp are stamped at the exact same time because they have the same break in the C. And through the collectors, it is deemed that these were probably done very, very, very much after the war, not during the war. During the war, it was found that items were marked with a single small letter C, meaning condemned, and wherever it was, that was the inspection point. The only items that we can find that were IC during the war, you'll see on that pistol grip, was a Confederate inspector's mark, not U.S. And then towards the bottom there, There was General Hancock's Veteran Corps. He had the Veteran Volunteers, as it says in the picture there. And a lot of people confuse the Veteran Volunteer Infantry with the Veteran Reserve Corps Infantry. And that was a mistake that was done during the war as well, where people would write saying, how does it feel working for Hancock or being in the Veteran Volunteer? And they say, no, I'm in the Veteran Reserve, which was formerly the Invalid Corps. All my items can be seen on my Facebook page. I have over 500 original pieces to the Invalid Corps, Veteran Reserve Corps. 99% of them are available for viewing on my site. The website is posted there as facebook.com/invalidcorps. You can email me directly if you're curious about an item, or if you have information for me or want information from me. My email I opened up for this is wedidforget@yahoo.com. And if you're interested in meeting with me, learning more from me, or having me as a speaker, I am located right now in the Pacific Northwest of Pennsylvania between Erie and Pittsburgh. And so again, my Facebook page, my email, wedidforget@yahoo.com. And I thank you for putting up with me.